What is Patreon, and how can you make the most of Patreon as a musician? The fact that you're watching a YouTube video right now leads me to believe that you have probably at least heard of Patreon already. If not, in a nutshell, Patreon is a crowdfunding service, kind of like Kickstarter or Indiegogo, but those are short-term campaigns with a single overarching monetary goal, whereas Patreon is an ongoing subscription service which potentially never ends. The goal with Patreon is to put the power of creativity back in the hands of creative people rather than record labels and businessmen. If you're familiar with the Pro Tips series already, I'm going to assume you're an independent musician and therefore hate record labels. I figured you out. I'm inside your head. I know what you're thinking. In this video, I'm going to talk about why you might use Patreon as a musician, how you could use it, and some tips and best practices for getting the most out of it. Let's begin. Why do musicians need money? And yes, I have heard people ask that before, in all seriousness. The thing I really like about Patreon is that it's promoting this culture of openness and honesty between creative people and their fans. So most creators on Patreon are quite happy to say to their fans, I'm using your money on rent, or to buy food, or new microphones, or guitar strings, or whatever else. Crowdfunding albums isn't new to music, not at all. Record labels have very gradually been losing power over the music we listen to for years. Record labels basically have three jobs. The first is quality control, making sure the music they're releasing is of a good enough quality to warrant releasing. Now, whether or not you think record labels are doing a good job of that anymore is beside the point. The second part of what they do is promotion, making sure that Joe Public actually knows there's an album about to be released. The third thing record labels do is fund studio time, because those tasty Neumann microphones cost more than your mum's house. So if you wanted to release your own music, you would have to do all of that yourself. Enter crowdfunding, which will help you cover the monetary costs of releasing an album, namely marketing and studio time. Quite common these days is for a musician to have their own little recording setup at home, so something like Patreon will allow them to gradually add to their recording setup and gradually improve the quality of the music they make at home, as well as spending it on food and rent and that kind of stuff. But then you can gradually release that music to your patrons exclusively in exchange for the money they're giving you every month. Lastly, in terms of money, and I don't want to get into a whole big thing here, but YouTube ad revenue isn't quite as free-flowing as it used to be, so people are looking at alternate ways to monetize their creative content. Patreon is very much leading the way in that regard. But how do you get people to subscribe? You can use what Patreon call reward tiers, which are basically prizes which vary in size dependent on how much money a supporter gives you every month. So a $1 subscription might literally get a piece of paper saying thank you, $5 subscription might get a lovely hat, $10 subscription could get a t-shirt, and a $100 subscription could maybe get an album named after the supporter or their face on the album cover or something weird like that. Patrons can select how much money they want to support rather than sticking to one of your tiers, so don't feel like you have to create a tier for every conceivable amount of money. That would be a waste. So you know what you're going to offer people, you know how much it's worth, but how do you actually convert all of your Twitter followers and Facebook likes into patrons? Well, obviously you're gonna have to tell them about it in some way, and you're probably going to use social media to do that. There's two things that we've learned over the years which you've got to bear in mind for everything social media related. The first thing to bear in mind with social media is that your posts need to be as visually engaging as possible. So whether you're using photos to evidence something you're talking about, or whether you're explaining it through a video, you've got to make it visually engaging. The second thing is that, from our experience, generally the best way to communicate with your fans is through a mailing list. We use MailChimp. I'm not being paid to tell you to use MailChimp. I just think it's really good. And a mailing list is really good because it allows you to communicate with both your fans who you found online through Twitter or whatever, but also with your fans who you find in real life at your gigs and stuff. And not everyone actually uses social media. Most people will have an email address, but not everyone's on Twitter or Facebook. So this allows you to combine all of your fans together in one handy list. And then you send out a newsletter when you're launching your Patreon campaign, when you add new rewards, or just when anything interesting happens on Patreon. The final thing I want to say about promoting your Patreon page is that you kind of want to have a fan base already before you start asking people for money. And I know that's disheartening to hear, but you can't just rock up on Patreon and expect people to start paying attention. You've got to already have something that you know through years of work is something people actually want and find useful, and therefore are likely to give you money to carry on doing. Don't just turn up and expect people to care. Ideas and best practices. Patreon is great because as a company, they clearly want their users to succeed. And to that end, they post a lot of really helpful blogs and send out a lot of newsletters with loads of information in. And I suggest you take a look at it, even if it's about things like podcasting or visual arts, which aren't immediately useful to you as a musician. There will be useful information in there somewhere, so I highly recommend taking a look at everything Patreon posts themselves. Generally, you want to offer your patrons more than just original music. Here is a list of things you could try doing over Patreon. Google Hangouts or Skype calls with your top contributors. Free downloads of all the stems of your music with a license to remix. If you're the kind of person that makes physical notes about your music as you're writing like I do, you could send your notebooks to a subscriber. Packs of old guitar strings. One-on-one tutorials where you explain what it is you do. Play a gig in their location of choice. Exclusive only to Patreon merchandise packs with stuff that you can't get anywhere else. Write a song about one of your supporters or about a subject matter of their choosing. Name an album after one of your supporters or use their face as album art. That's a lot of stuff. Go on, do it, off you go. Find a niche. This is the same with pretty much everything creative, but if you're making Minecraft videos, you're not going to stand out because everyone else is making Minecraft videos. We're saturated with Minecraft videos. Please stop making Minecraft videos. Thank you. And yeah, that's not specific to Patreon, but it bears repeating. In general, unfortunately, people tend to switch off when you start talking about Patreon if they're not expecting you to start talking about Patreon. What seems to work for people is the following. Make your Patreon URL easily accessible to everyone, so use it in the end screen of your YouTube videos or in the video description, and obviously have links to it in the about section of whatever social media you're using. Don't mention Patreon loads in blogs or videos that aren't specifically about Patreon because people will just skip over them. I've seen the metadata, no one watches them. But do make separate videos explaining what your Patreon is and what it does, or sketches pointing people towards Patreon. You've just got to make it really clear in the thumbnail and the description and all of that stuff that this is about Patreon. That way, people who are your die-hard fans or who are actually considering giving you some money will watch it and enjoy it, but the people who get butthurt about that kind of thing won't have to watch it and won't get butthurt, so everyone wins. Imagine an internet where people are happy. I can't, it's too hard. Unfortunately, there will be people who think you are greedy for even having a Patreon, regardless of how much money you're making from it, so just accept some people to be arseholes about it. Use Patreon as a secondary source of income. Now, Patreon seem to be doing everything right as a company, so I don't think they're going to disappear overnight. But if they did, and that was where all your money is coming from, then you're kind of screwed, aren't you? It's the same with Google. If all of your income is tied up in Google advertising and Google, for no reason, just disappears down the toilet one day, that's all of your money gone. So as a musician, go ahead and create music specifically for your patrons over Patreon and do work on your Patreon channel, but don't put all of your efforts into doing that. You've got to keep looking for students, gigs, film schools, whatever it is you do. Just don't put... There's something about eggs in baskets, isn't there? Don't basket all your eggs in one. Green eggs and ham. Final tip, don't ever stop creating. Be regular and consistent in both your timetable of uploading or creating and the quality of work that you put out. And also, don't be afraid to document your creative process as well. People will really want to see how you do what you do, and don't be afraid to put that out as content in its own right. To finish, I'm going to give you a selection of musical Patreon accounts that I think you should take a look at because I really like what they're doing. They are the following. I'm just going to read this off the list. Hollens, Spagnola, Pentatonix, and Neely. Go look those people up and look at what they're doing, how they're using Patreon, and how it's fitting in with what they were doing already online. That is everything from this episode of Pro Tips for Independent Bands. I will see you next time. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you like, and leave any comments or suggestions in the comments section below. I'll see you later. I think I should get a prize for not having mentioned the Stab Panda Patreon at all. If you like pro tips, if you like what we do, we'd be awfully appreciative if you took a look at our Patreon account, which is in the little orange and white button somewhere below me right now. So if you want to check us out on that, that'd be really nice. And we will see you next time. Toodaloo.